Welcome to the Pillars of Leadership podcast. I want to welcome Dr. Bryan Dik. Hello, sir.
Hello, Doug. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to see you again. So we met in Colorado when I was there, but I met you reading all your materials and research long before that when I was completing my PhD. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, lots of wisdom. Today we're going to be talking about calling, meaning in life, job satisfaction, and discovering your calling and helping others to find their calling as well. So, Dr. Dik is married with four sons, Fort Collins, Colorado. I miss the sports success there with the Nuggets and Avs and their championships. Are the Rockies going to get one this year?
Highly unlikely.
Very highly unlikely, but we shall see. Dr. Dik has written four books. I read his book, Redeeming Work, which is we're going to talk about a little bit today. You can check out his website at bryandik.com, but he covers some interesting topics where faith, work, and meaning intersect. And he's a vocational psychologist, a professor at Colorado State, teaches religion, psychology, and does some career and vocational work, which we'll talk about. And he's an entrepreneur when we talk about that endeavor, a scholar. His research is on meaning and purpose in the workplace and calling and vocation and career development. Now, if you go to his website and pull up his resume, you can have a couple days worth of reading. That CV is 37 pages long, and I could take the whole show, Bryan, going through that, but I won't do it. I'll spare everyone. But redeeming work and making your job a calling. And you've achieved many distinguished honors and awards, 114 publications. You've been quoted in Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Working Mother, Good Housekeeping, and many more. Did I miss anything in your background that you want to emphasize or anything new that
No,
you're
I
up to?
think that's plenty sufficient. I'm glad you included good housekeeping. Thank you.
It's key.
Yeah.
Um, so what brought upon this passion for meaning and calling?
Well, a lot of us in psychology say that research is me search. One of the things that motivates us to study the things that we study are personal concerns. And so, if sometimes I start this story by going back to my life as an undergraduate, which I went to Calvin University in Michigan. I had a fantastic experience there. It was a wonderful place. But I was at a period in life where I was just struggling with making decisions and figuring out what I was supposed to do with my life. And so, I was a good student. I ended up going to graduate school. I chose counseling psychology as the path I was going to pursue, partly because, as far as I could tell, it had the greatest breadth of any of the other
Mhm.
areas of psychology. And so I knew that counseling psychologists could teach, they could do research, they could go into private practice, they could consult for organizations. And so by pursuing that path, it effectively, allowed me to delay the decision of really what I was going to focus on. And while I was a graduate student at University of Minnesota, I was training with an advisor who was a world expert in vocational interests. So I was learning a lot about career development. And I was reading as a Christian, I was reading a lot of practical theology, but I was studying psychology and how to apply the methods of science to understand abstract psychological mechanisms and so forth. And I just kind of started to put the two together. I thought, one of the all these things I'm learning from the reading I'm doing about calling and meaning and purpose um, have been investigated somewhat, but not a lot at that
Mhm.
time within psychology. And I thought maybe one of the ways that I can use the training that I have been acquiring is to apply this to these topics that are of great interest to me. And so all of that is to say, I kind of discerned that part of my calling is better understanding using the methods of science, what it looks like to experience and live out a calling. And so because that's so personally meaningful to me, and because I was in an environment that supported, digging into this in a serious way, it's just been something that has been a core focus and something I've been very motivated by for my whole career.
Well, it's evident your passion really comes through in your research as well as your writing. Not oftentimes you don't find that passion and interest outside of the scholarly academic world when people do this research. But your stuff is easy to read, it's practical, and it makes a great impact.
Well, thank you. I've always been concerned about the ivory tower phenomenon, where you go to these conferences and year after year, and you're presenting some of the technical work, and it's the same people, it's the same group of scholars, and publishing in these journals, and the concern is these sometimes feels like only get read by other scholars, and but it's so practical, and I think a big part of my mission on this planet is really to translate some of what we're learning in doing this technical research into ways that can be impactful for lay people, for folks on the ground, for folks who really need to apply this to their own lives. And so there's always been a gap there, and hopefully part of the way I spend my time is bridging that gap. And so yeah, that's always been very important to me.
Yeah, we'll talk about kind of the seasons of calling because as we've discussed before, they do change and it's not a one-time event, it's a process. But
Mhm.
um, I you kind of forced me or challenged me to write down what I thought my call was.
Mm.
I've in the past written a vision statement for myself or a mission, but as I began to think about what am I going to do with my education and such, I really felt like it was to help other people find meaning in life and purpose and their calling. And it sounds similar. If I were to ask you what is your calling today, what would you say that is?
I think all the things that I've been engaged in with respect to my work, if we're thinking about it within that domain of life, I would say it's really about helping people understand what makes them unique and then identify pathways for expressing their gifts in ways that make the world better. So the research I've carried out have sort of been connected to that theme. The practical tools and things that I've been privileged to help develop have been focused on that. And so, yeah, that would be how I'd say it.
So this pathway you just I don't it's a commercial opportunity time, but it's really a quite an amazing tool. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Pathway U is a platform. It's a career assessment system. The story behind Pathway U is I collaborated with a colleague of mine who at the time was at Colorado State. Now he's at University of Memphis. His name was Kraiger. And we got a grant from the U.S. Department of Education to develop what at the time was a very crude online assessment system where students, initially it was in the community college system in Colorado, could log in, take a few brief assessments, learn about their interests and values, and then we developed some algorithms to take their pattern of results and then map them onto different career paths, so that they could learn more about themselves, but also explore career paths predicted to fit them well. And so that grant process went well. Our university, Colorado State, became interested in exploring the possibility of creating a company to commercialize that. Kurt and I, knowing as academics, if it was just up to us, it would only ever be a cool idea with a crude website. We needed some business acumen behind it, so we connected with a couple of entrepreneurs, and we founded the company Jobzology. That was in 2012. And we did a lot of things as we tried to grow and develop the products that we were offering. And what we ended up settling in on is this platform that the main focus is really colleges and universities. We sold site licenses to schools who could then deploy it with their students. And again, thinking back to kind of where I started and what I needed when I was an undergraduate, the idea of undergraduates across the country now having access to this platform where they can take some brief assessments, learn about themselves, benefit from these patented algorithms, and then explore career paths that fit them well. It's gratifying to see that happen.
Yeah, it's great. And I think individuals can do it. I was logging in. I didn't get all the way in, but $55 or so.
Yeah, you could purchase an individual account, or if you buy Redeeming Work, the book, then you get free access. Readers of that book get free access through a version of it
Great.
connected with the book.
Well, I got to tell you, this book, Redeeming Work, is just one of my favorite books. And as far as being practical, but helping you to do some soul searching, but actually doing some practical analysis to try and figure out what your call is. It's called Redeeming Work, a guide to discovering God's calling for your career. So how would you define a call? Because if you go to Calvin University, a lot of the students there would, it's called Calvin College when I was in Grand Rapids, but if you
Yeah.
were a Calvin student, you'd understand that word, but it kind of comes across to some maybe outside the church world as a churchy word when really
Yeah.
it's not. But how would you define calling?
Well, it's interesting. There's in the scholarly world, there's a lot of discussion and debate about how to define it. And we could go down a rabbit hole now about how languages evolve and words over time take on different meanings and maybe can mean slightly different things to different people. I'd say for Christians, you can think about the general call into a relationship with Jesus Christ and a life of discipleship that God extends to people. And then there's also this what the Puritans referred to as the specific call, which is really focused on vocation. Where's my area of service within the world? But in terms of the way I study that concept in psychological research, I think of a calling as having three dimensions. There's a transcendent summons, purposeful work, and then an other-oriented approach to things. And so, and I'm kind of talking about this within the work role. I think a calling is broader than just the work role. But as a vocational psychologist, I've studied it specifically within the work role. So a transcendent summons is this idea that a person is called to approach, they experience a desire to approach work in this way because they're guided by a force outside themselves. The purposeful work idea has to do with the notion that what you do with your job or with your work aligns with what's most important to you in life. It's not compartmentalized or separate from that. They sync up. And then the greater good or the other orientation is the idea that you approach work in this way, not for your own happiness, but because of a desire to contribute to the world around you, to make others' lives better. And so that's kind of the three parts of our definition is really focused on those things.
Yeah, that's great definition. It's interesting because I think in your book you stated that 42% said they had a calling to a particular line of work. So that leaves a whole 58% out there that need to discover this. And any thoughts? And we'll talk more about how people can do that on a practical basis. But why 40%? Why not 20% or why not 80%? You did a lot of research on this, obviously.
Well, that number was that came from a national stratified sample, and that was pre-pandemic data. So it'd be interesting to see what things
Mm,
look like. We were expecting less, honestly. We were surprised. A sense of calling is more prevalent than we expected. But I think a lot of people think of their work as a means to an end, a means to a paycheck, and just have a very utilitarian approach to it. And there's lots of reasons for that. Other people, there's this really strong achievement orientation, and their work is kind of a means to um, uh, express, or, climb a ladder. And a calling orientation is unique. I mean, that focus on generativity, on using my gifts to make the world better somehow. Why 40%? I'm not really sure. I think I think it is a human universal that we're wired in a way that where we want to make sense of our experience. We want it to matter. And so I think a lot of people desire that, but for whatever reason, not everyone is able to experience it. Some of those they're barriers, and some of those are individual or personal barriers, like a lack of confidence or a reluctance to take risks. And some of it is our external barriers, like lack of access to opportunity
mm.
or to education. So there are a lot of things that work against being able to approach work as a calling, but for the people who experience it, it's a big deal.
Yeah, your book does a nice job of really delineating kind of the differences. I tried to summarize some of those into this is not research based, so I'll just go on record with that. And I'd be interested on your thoughts. Obviously, the book does a great job, but like you said, a job would tend to be driven around meeting your needs,
Mhm.
having a paycheck, an occupation, those basic level needs. In a career, people tend to look at advancement and status, significance, serving others. Everybody has a different motivation, and some aren't looking for career development. I'm doing a lot of teaching on career and leadership development. But then this whole topic of calling and my research did show that there's a correlation between this generative behavior, wanting to make a difference, wanting to leave a legacy, wanting to help bring satisfaction, fulfillment, you know, job meaningfulness to other people can be, maybe not in the spiritual sense, a calling per se. Maybe God isn't calling you to do that, but maybe you're in a position to fulfill that mission or help with the public greater good. Anything from your end to delineate the difference? Because I hear the word vocation too. How does that fit in here?
Yeah, well, vocation and calling can be, I mean, the word vocation literally means to call. It comes from the Latin vocare, which means to call. And so, there's a way to understand vocation that makes it synonymous with calling.
Okay.
But the word vocation is one of those that have evolved in the English language. A lot of us, we hear the word vocation, people think of it as a synonym of just an occupation, or they think of a vocational school, like a trade school. And so it's taken on some broader meanings. To a greater extent maybe than the word calling has. So what's the difference? It probably depends a little bit on who you ask. I think a kind of a rich understanding of vocation would have very little difference between that and a calling. But I think the way many people encode that word now, it just has kind of a simpler meaning, just kind of the work that people do, and a calling still connotes that really deep um, passion, meaning, purpose, generativity, like you're saying, in that transcendent summons.
Yeah, and you talk about meaning and purpose and job satisfaction. When you look at leadership, the kind of the why here is what can you do as a leader and why it's important, I think intuitively we probably know that we want our employees to find meaning. We want them to be satisfied with their jobs. But your research says that those with a calling are happier, have more life satisfaction, are better at coping, have a stronger sense of purpose, and are even more productive at work. So there's a lot of benefits other than just helping the individual.
Absolutely. I think people with a calling are the best employees. There's there's a lot of personal benefits. Usually, I say usually because there can be some dark side impacts of having a calling or some vulnerabilities at times, and we can get into that if you want. But ordinarily, it's a really positive thing. Someone who experiences their work as a calling also, people also report all of those positive career development outcomes that you're describing, and it's not something that's limited to benefits within the work realm like job satisfaction and commitment and that kind of thing. It's also linked to general well-being, like sense of meaning in life as a whole, and subjective well-being or happiness. So yeah, a sense of calling ordinarily is really good for people.
Yeah. So talk about the that job satisfaction
Hmm.
that you talked about. So it brings, I think your research said that those with a calling are more committed to their jobs, they're more satisfied with their jobs, and they're more motivated at work. So there's research now that shows that.
Yeah, that has come up again and again. In fact, in 2023, there was a meta-analysis published, the first one on calling research. A meta-analysis, that's a study of studies. So a group of researchers looked at all the studies that have been published that look at these relationships that you're talking about, and then they kind of use some statistical ways of making summary statements. And one of the conclusions is a sense of calling is closely associated with job satisfaction. So, job satisfaction, what is that? I mean, it's a cognitive appraisal of, um, your job. How do you feel about it, and what do you think about it? And um, you know, think about your own experiences on the job. If you asked people, all in all, how satisfied are you in your job? You do a kind of a mental calculation. You think a lot of different aspects of your job, and then you kind of rate internally, yeah, this is going really well. This part of it is going less well. There are different facets of satisfaction. How satisfied are you with the support that you get, with the interest in the work itself, with the pay and benefits, with how you get along with coworkers, that kind of thing. So it's actually a kind of a complex variable.
Mhm.
Um, but where a calling shines is when you ask people about kind of the intrinsic satisfaction they experience with the work itself. Usually that's where the strongest relationships are. So the greater the extent you feel called to something, the more likely you are to be satisfied with the work itself, not just what comes with the work, the external rewards, but with what you experience in doing the work itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always tried to make the workplace a fun place to come to. It's not always, there's a lot of pressure and there's results and expectations, but if people are dreading coming to work, number one, is it their calling? And that's another question, I guess, is, well, what if it's not your calling and you're calling somewhere else and you're in this job, whatever that
Mhm.
job may be.
Mhm.
Hypothetical here. I'm not speaking from experience at all. But how do you as a leader or even as yourself as an individual um work on that? And I don't you mentioned maybe I think it was you mentioned something about your calling is built.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that has anything to do with this or not, or can you comment on that?
Yeah. I mean, so there's kind of two parts to that.
Yeah.
One is what can leaders do to create an environment where people can lean into their callings and feel empowered and living them out. Um, you know, I do think creating an environment of trust where workers feel like they have the ability, um, to make decisions and to express their gifts without someone looking over their shoulder, um, without lots of unnecessary pressure. Everyone has a job description. Everyone has things that they're required to do. But within those objectives and metrics, there's a lot of freedom
Mhm.
to approach work in a way that really allows your gifts to shine. And so when employees are able to do that in an environment where they're supported, there's support and there's trust and there's demands are not unreasonable, and there's a focus on their own health and well-being, I think that creates the conditions where people are able to really um, overcome those internal barriers and live out their callings. Now, the idea of a calling being something that's built instead of discovered. My first book with Ryan Duffy, we gave that book the title "Make Your Job a Calling." We did that very intentionally. We didn't call it "Discover the Job That Will Be Your Calling," but rather "Make Your Job a Calling." You earlier said a calling is an ongoing process, and the research points to that being the case. It's not a thing to be discovered where, like you're looking for the keys that fell out of your pocket when you're sitting in the couch, and you lift up the cushions and you're digging around to find it, and you're looking, and then when you find it, you're done. You've got them, and then you've got what you need and you can take off. A calling is not like that. It's an ongoing process. Really, by definition of having a calling, it means that you are always asking questions. How can I do more? How can I expand my sphere of influence? Is what I'm doing now the optimal way of expressing my gifts to make the world better? How can I do that more effectively? And a lot of people who identify with this concept of calling, they didn't necessarily make a decision. Hey, this job, this is my calling. I discovered it. Now I'm going to enter into it. It was something that emerged.
Mhm.
They had an opportunity that fit well with who they are. Things started to go well. They started to experience meaning, and then kind of looking at the situation, maybe even looking back, they come to the determination later, yeah, this is a calling. This is more than just a job. Maybe it started as a job, but it turned into
Right.
a calling. So that ongoing process, I think, is really important because so many people who are miserable in their jobs, they want to just discover another option. They want to
Right.
discover something. And the idea of doing that and then riding off happily into the sunset, it's a romantic idea, but it doesn't
Yeah.
really map with reality.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd say a lot of people, myself included, have a lot of passions that they're not able to exercise on a full-time basis. And an opportunity to do that presents itself every day at work through I had one evangelist say the need is the call. And that's a whole nother
Mm,
discussion because you can have so many needs and you're not able to say no. And that can be an issue with, is this really my, obviously the Good Samaritan story is a great example of the need being a call. At that moment, there was a need, and a couple people didn't exercise that need, and one did. And so I think that's a great concept, is building that call and not discovering it. Because I think you mentioned your book Fallacies
mm,
about one's call, and one of those is, and please talk about some others as well, but one of those was, well, it's a call to ministry, right?
mm.
You've got to be, to have an effective call, or to be a good person or a good believer, you've got to be in the ministry, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Is that one of those fallacies?
Yeah, well, I mean, the redeeming work, obviously it's a book for Christians, and I think these half truths are things that many Christians can get stuck on, or have to work out. So yeah, if I'm serious about my faith, I should consider ministry and missions before anything else. That's one of those half truths. I call it a half truth because, hey, missions is important and ministry is important. We need more good ministers and missionaries. But thinking of it that way, like if I'm really serious about my faith, I should consider this first, implies that anyone working outside of formal ministry or missions is not serious about their faith. And that experience tells us otherwise. You can find spiritual leaders and faith heroes within any profession. But the other thing about that in particular, that half truth, is it really ignores the role of gifts in discerning a calling. And, I talk about that a lot. It's people are different, and the ways that we're different have implications for where we're well equipped to serve. And so I think a big part of discerning a calling is paying attention to what your interests are, what your values are, what your strengths are, and then evaluating opportunities and needs, and then charting a path that allows you to express those gifts in ways that make the world better. If you're doing that well, then you kind of feel like a swimmer gliding with the current rather than laboring against it. It's that kind of like optimal fit situation. And so lots of theologians talk about God's callings being mediated rather than revealed in a direct way through an audible voice. And I think our gifts is really one of the key ways that our callings are mediated. So anyway, that speaks to that particular half truth. You wanted to talk about some
Yeah,
others?
the other churchy
Yeah,
one that I always loved, and
yeah,
you had it in there as a half truth, and I went,
mhm,
wow, you're right. It was God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called.
yeah, yeah. You hear that often, and usually it's expressed by people who have just some misgivings about the job that they're in, and can they do it. I remember hearing a leader is actually president of a college, a Christian college, talking about how before he had assumed the role of president of that college, he had not been an academic. Um, and really felt like, is this really something that I can do? But the board had asked him to apply, and the question is, why had the board of that college asked him to apply? Well, it was because he had shown the gifts of leadership. He had been a successful pastor of a large church, and had the gifts to serve in a leadership role in a slightly different environment. And so he's telling the story, and he says, well, but God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. And it's absolutely God equips the called. Once people discern a calling, and then they can expect that God will bless their efforts as they work to serve him faithfully in the role that they're in. But you know what? There's a reason that that president was invited to apply by the board. It was because he had
Mhm.
leadership qualities, he had leadership abilities and gifts, and had demonstrated that. And so, God equips the called, he also calls the equipped. When people say that God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called, they usually talk about people like Moses. In
Right.
scripture, Moses was very concerned about his ability as a public speaker, and sort of complained in that burning bush incident or event about, can I really do this when I don't speak well? And, God says, well, trust me. And also I'll give you your brother who can help overcome that, Aaron. But does that mean that Moses was not well equipped to, lead the people out of Egypt into the promised land? Think about it. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's palace. I mean, he was retrieved
Right.
out of the basket by, it. So anyway, clearly there's a reason that God chose him. It wasn't random. It was, um, I infer, in part because he's very well equipped. What better person to present God's case to Pharaoh than the person who grew up in the palace? And so, anyway, there are other examples, but that's one where when people say God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called, I always say, well, I think he does both. I think he does both.
That's good. That's good. One more half truth here. The other one that I liked was the
Mm.
well, I might miss my calling. I might
Hmm.
miss my dream relationship. If you're in the dating scene and there's
Yeah.
only one person for each other and it's pure destiny. Is God's calling work that way? And how much do you have to worry about being outside of God's will? That sort of thing.
Yeah, that I mean you mentioned it's like relationships, that concept of the soulmate. So the way some people think about finding their soulmate, like there's one person out there in the universe that I'm supposed to be with, probably another student at my same college or university or whatever. And if I don't find that person, I'm going to be doomed to a life of misery and loneliness. And then that same way of thinking then gets applied to choosing a career. If I get this wrong, I'm going to be stuck, living outside the center of God's will, and I'm going to be miserable. And that's just really dangerous thinking, and it doesn't really align with what the Bible tells us about, or at least principles in the Bible that we can apply to making decisions. A few things about God's will that are very clear in Scripture. One is God's will of decree. So we can read in the Bible that God is sovereign and in control. That's God's will of decree. There's God's will of desire, which is that we are obedient. It's very clear that God wills us to obey Him and desires that we do that. But when people are thinking about making a choice, like what's my calling? How do I discern that? They're thinking about God's will of direction. What's God's will for my life? That's the will of direction. And that's not so clear. It seems to be the case that we have some freedom to make choices. And so, for more of us, or for many of us, I would say probably for most of us, there's more than one right answer. There are probably multiple right answers to that question, what's my calling? And it's okay to choose one and then not live with regret, but to trust that the Lord will bless you as you move forward in that path.
That's great.
And then, kind of tied to that, going back to a point we explored before, discerning living a calling, it's a process. It's an ongoing process. It's not a once and for all event. For all of these reasons that if I'm not careful, I might miss my calling, I think it's just a dangerous way of thinking, and it's totally unnecessary.
That's a good word. It's a good word for my season of life right now.
Mm,
I was recently reading, can't remember the book. Os Guinness, I think, was writing
mm,
about the call,
mhm.
and and I read a couple. Gordon Smith, I think, was another one,
Yeah, yep,
and I was writing down these different types of waiting because sometimes we're waiting for that great call. We're waiting for God's will to be unveiled, and most of us aren't going to hear that you know we'll hear a still small voice or we'll hear
yeah.
no voice.
Mm,
But I was reading about those types of waiting, quiet waiting, expectant waiting, confident waiting, patient waiting. Here's my
yeah.
favorite, frustrated waiting. You
Yeah,
talked about active versus passive waiting. Any
yeah,
coaching you can give us there?
yeah. Back when I was an undergraduate trying to figure out what's God's will for my career, I was engaged in a pray and wait approach. So I would pray and plead with God to reveal to me what the answer was to this question I was wrestling with. And I don't think I was expecting an audible voice, but I did expect that if I just prayed more, had more faith, waited patiently, that one day I would sort of wake up with a revelation. I would just know. It would be clear to me somehow. And sometimes God works that way. Um, I've talked with a few people for whom that's been the way they experienced or discovered their calling, but only a few. And for most of the rest of us, it's definitely something to pray about. But I think praying for wisdom, instead of praying for a revelation, is probably a wiser
Mm.
course. And instead of praying for a revelation and then just waiting for that to happen, but then not doing anything when there are clearly things that people can do to learn about themselves, to explore opportunities, to discover their gifts, to lean on the wisdom of mentors and important other people in our lives. This is where I say pray, but then pray and be active. Engage in a process where you're learning about your gifts, you're exploring opportunities, you're leaning on the advice of others. If you do that, then I think the answers you're looking for will start to emerge. But it does require some wisdom.
This process, you mentioned the word discovery there again. And so, one of the things I like what you said earlier about being built, but also discovery is the trying new things. I remember when our
Yeah.
kids were little and my bent is baseball and
Mm.
I wanted them to be baseball stars, right? And pay for my retirement. And if
Yeah.
nothing else, just to enjoy it because I love watching baseball and coaching it. But, letting them discover who they were, our son ended up being a tennis player and daughter danced. And so I remember when I chose my college of choice, I chose that college based on making sure they didn't have a speech class requirement because I was terrified of getting in front of people. And yet, when I was in a singles group in church, our singles pastor said, "Hey, why don't you come teach our Sunday school class?" And I froze and I said, I had to really kind of pray through that and said, "Okay, I'm going to do it." And, long story short, now 20, 30 years later, and I love getting in front of people. I love teaching. And so if I wouldn't have gone through that discovering process, God may call you to do something uncomfortable. And it may not
Yeah.
even be a
Yeah.
calling, it may just be somebody asking you, just try it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. I think it's very helpful to have a learning orientation, to kind of approach life in a way where it's like, hey, what can I learn about myself, about the world that I didn't know yesterday? And if you kind of approach the world that way, then new opportunities emerge. You develop the ability to sort of roll with the punches, to adapt to new situations. You discover things about yourself that you might not have realized was the case before. Like, I mean, look at the teaching that you're doing now. Whereas before there was a level of disdain toward public speaking that it influenced your college choice. So until you try some things out, it can be difficult to know fully where your strengths lie. And if you engage the world that way, you discover more about kind of how you're wired, where your strengths are. That helps you make more informed choices then about what paths to follow in the future.
I laugh so hard in your book. 97-year-old dies unaware of being violin prodigy.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, that was an excerpt from The Onion, the satirical newspaper. And so I came across that story, and this, like, imagine an elderly lady who dies, and her whole career she was a post office worker, and but she was totally oblivious to the fact that had she ever picked up a violin, she would have become a world-class virtuoso. I don't know that that's really how it works, right? If that hypothetical person approached the world in a way that expressed a learning orientation, then whatever skill and interest she had in creating music or engaging in self-expression like that, expressing artistic interests, they would have found a way to shine. And it might not have been with a violin, but it would have been part of how she lived her life. And so, yeah, that was a funny anecdote that gets back to that fear of like making the wrong choice and then missing my calling.
Right. Yeah, that was good.
Mhm.
Can you share a pivotal moment or memorable experience that helped shape your call, or was there not an audible voice experience or discovery moment or something specific?
Yeah, no, I did not have an audible voice, and it's hard to pin down to a specific event. Um, for many people, it's a gradual process. And over time, the experiences that you have accumulate and then point to a path forward. The closest thing that I can get to it is I do remember deep into my graduate studies at University of Minnesota. I think I took something like 6 courses related to vocational psychology. I was doing research on the strong interest inventory. I was really trying, but all without really having a clear sense of what path I should follow. Should I have a research career? Should I teach? Should I, you know, be a psychotherapist? All these things were options, and I just was not particularly clear. But I remember reading a book called "The Fabric of This World." It was written by a philosopher, Lee Hardy, and the subtitle of the book was "Inquiries into Calling, Career Choice, and the Design of Human Work." It was a philosophy book with a lot of history in it. It was not a psychology book, but I remember having just sort of reviewed research in psychology on the concept of calling and been kind of shocked at how little there was at that time. Kind of wrestling with, hey, is this something that I should do? And then reading that book, philosophical study of calling and the design of human work, things started to connect for me. I started to kind of write down in my notebook research questions, ideas that were articulated in a way that was exciting to me by this philosopher, but that hadn't really been tested using psychological science. And I started to just make those connections. I think that helped embolden my sense that, you know what, I could maybe start a career pursuing these kinds of questions. I think there's a way to do that. I think it could work, could be productive. It could be something that could get published in the right kinds of journals. And so then when I went on the job market, that was part of what I had in mind. That's part of what I talked about wanting to do in my job talk and in my interview, and then that kind of led to what's emerged over the course of my career.
And it's been amazing. And so I hope we can get this word out to people that research can be fun. I never thought that was the case, but during my 5 years of research, boy, it is really a discovery process, and you discover a lot about you. And
Yes,
you hear voices and get to know people who've been gone for centuries. And
that's
so
right.
I appreciate your work on that. What challenges I think about some of my own personal challenges in following my calling. And, one of them will be, well, I'm not getting paid for this, even though this is my passion. I don't know if you're familiar with the Japanese Ikigai,
Yeah,
and it,
yeah,
you know, it talks about your experience, your talent, your gifts, but also your passion. And I try to
right.
do that with my employees, is to discover what their passions are. And you can really help to develop someone's calling, but also increase their job satisfaction by letting them plug into a project or to something that has a passion bent to it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
are there any thoughts around that, or challenges personally that you've faced in following your calling, or how do you reconcile that passion with, well, it doesn't pay the bills, right? I'm called to be at home and to lead in my family, but it may not pay the bills. So I asked about 10 questions there for you.
Well, the part of what's in that question is how do you do this in the real world with the responsibilities and obligations that each of us face and carry. And I think, there is, if you read a lot about calling and passion and purpose and all of that stuff, there can at times be sort of a Pollyanna feel to it. Like it's just unrealistically um, uh, positive. There are books with titles like "Do What You Love and the Money Will Follow," and it's I kind of appreciate the sentiment, but come on, you know. So I do think it's important to recognize that there's a difference between the ideal world and the real world, and unfortunately, we live in the real one. not the ideal one. And so there's always compromise. Whenever we try to, pursue what we're passionate about, but also do that in a way that recognizes, hey, we need to put food on the table. There's always some level of compromise. But that's really that's part of, that's just at the heart of it. That's part of living this stuff out on this side of heaven in the real world. It's having the wisdom to evaluate each opportunity in light of, is this going to be life-giving to me? Is it going to allow me to meet my obligations? What's the need? Can I rise up and respond to it? You know, it's complicated, it's messy, and that's, I think we just need to embrace that. That as we live this stuff out, it's helpful to have general principles to kind of abide by, but in terms of how the rubber hits the road in the real world, it's not always do what you love and the money will follow. You strive to find ways to express your gifts uh, with the constraints that are in place in ways that make the world better. I think that's what that's about. But every job has elements of it that feel like a grind at times.
Yeah.
It's unrealistic to think otherwise. So, but anyway, so yeah, we live in the real world, not the ideal world.
I think you answered all 10 questions there.
I might have. My
You,
meandering response maybe tapped into.
well, it was a meandering question, so it's perfect. But your next book should be seven steps to discovering your call then, right?
Maybe so. Yeah.
I wanted to share this with people because you're very practical. And so this whole topic of discovery, discerning your gifts, and this you talked about this a couple times in your book, was how to discern your calling. And can you talk to this for us?
There's a New Testament principle around gifts. Paul talks about how the church is like a body with different parts, and each part is important. One can't say to the next, "You're not important." All of them are important. All of them have to, kind of work together for the well-being of the whole. And so, as I apply that to, making career choices, I think of, and I'm not the first person to do this. I think if you read the Puritans, they wrote about how Paul's instruction to the church extends to the way people engage in the vocations within the marketplace. I'm unique, and I need to understand how I'm unique in order to figure out which paths I'm well suited for. And vocational psychologists have studied this for a long time and have identified several um, aspects of individual differences that can be reliably measured and that translate to good outcomes in terms of career choices. And so I'm just going to focus on the top part of your figure here, because the two that I think are really important starting points are interests and values. And we talked about Pathway U earlier. Within Pathway U, there's a measure of interests, there's a measure of values, and that's what forms the basis of our algorithm. So interests are just what you enjoy, what you're curious about, and there's a way to assess how you're different than other people in terms of your interests. Values refers to what's important to you or what you need in a work environment in order to be satisfied. And so, um, you know, when I understand that I'm the type of person whose interests can be described as social and artistic, I need to be in roles where I'm around people, helping people, and also where I'm engaging in self-expression. And when I understand that my values can be, in terms of work, can be described as, achievement oriented and relationship oriented, I need to be in a role where I can,
Yeah.
make the most of my abilities and where I get along well with the people I'm around and can be helpful to folks. Then, some career paths satisfy those interests and those values more so than others. Which ones? And so that all that is grist for the mill of making an informed career choice. So, yeah.
That's helpful. Yeah, that was great. I think, we won't talk about it this time, but you talked about, job search matches and care
Mhm.
abouts, finding something that matches your gifts, finding a culture that matches is a really good one. And then something that matches your calling. So much good stuff in the book, Redeeming Work. And kind of want to close out with just one last question for you. You
Yeah.
talked about prayer earlier,
Mm.
and I really like your take on spiritual practices regarding a job search and calling. So obviously that prayer and even fasting might be something to recommend. But any other thoughts on spiritual practices?
Well, I think of spiritual practices, and I'll share a few that I think are helpful, but I think these are important for setting the tone or creating the environment in which you're open to God's movement. And so solitude and silence, uh, just just figuring out a posture, practicing a posture of listening to God, of quieting all of the clutter, of directing your focus to God, away from all of the competing things. That's one um, set of practices that is helpful. A deep reading of Scripture, so not just reading for information, but a kind of meditative reading of the words of Scripture, and then prayer, but not just praying in general. Particular type of prayer. Um, there's the prayer of quiet trust, where you're surrendering yourself to God. There's a prayer for indifference, where you're not expressing ambivalence, but rather you're expressing a desire to God to be indifferent to anything except His presence and His will. And then there's the prayer for wisdom, um, where you're just asking for the Lord to bless you with a sound understanding of who you are, of what the needs are in the world, and how you can kind of bridge the gap between those. Um, those practices do not often, um, lead to some kind of revelation, but
Yeah.
they create the conditions. I think they create a posture in which someone is listening and is available. And then if you pair that with some, wise practices of not solely these spiritual practices, but like career development practices that I write about a lot in the book, then that I think creates the environment in which clarity starts to emerge.
Yeah, that was probably, and maybe it was the timing for myself when I read the
Mm,
book, but just probably my favorite part of the book was really getting myself into a position of not just praying for a new job,
yeah.
but really that, and my wife and I have been praying together, that is that
Mm,
prayer for indifference, because she has some desires, some needs that need to be met. I have desires and needs to be met. Our kids do. And so, praying for wisdom, praying for having a quiet trust, as you mentioned, praying for God's will, surrendering our will, indifference.
yeah.
That was really a meaningful section of the book, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So, any last words, Bryan, on somebody who's what advice you might give to someone who's trying to find their calling? I think part of it was maybe you're trying too hard, or don't
Well,
don't try too hard, or try differently.
I mean, I guess the last words of wisdom, don't go it alone. Um, Decisions about what comes next, they're best made not in a vacuum, but within a community of support. And a simple exercise that I often recommend is name a personal board of directors. Companies have boards of directors, organizations do, and so take that principle and apply it to the individual. Who in your life do you consider um, as a support, as kind of having a mentoring role in your life, who can give you candid um, input, and who doesn't have an agenda? And then name 3 to 5 of those people and then connect with them individually, and then pay attention to where their advice starts to converge. And you'll get support, so you won't feel isolated and alone as you navigate it, but you'll also get some good wisdom. And when you pair that with all of the other stuff, paying attention to your gifts, exploring opportunities, and thinking about needs in the world and all that stuff, then in time, the idea is clarity will begin to emerge.
Excellent, excellent advice. And my one piece of advice, it'd be to myself mostly, but would be just like your book title is make your job a calling.
Hmm.
Make wherever you are in life, to even if you're unemployed
Yeah.
or you're retired, is look for those opportunities. Blackaby wrote a book, Experiencing God, where find where God's moving.
Mm.
And I agree with a lot of that. And I also agree about he may create a path for you
Yeah.
that you hadn't even thought about. I read about one individual who was she couldn't leave her bed. She was bedridden at the end of her life, and her calling became to be is to put a prayer on a post-it note and have someone put it on the wall for her. So she had a whole wall of post-it notes. And even though most people would see her as disabled and not adding value, or not having a call, she had probably a call that is one of the
Mm.
most amazing calls. And
Mm.
so,
Wow. Yeah.
make that position in life a calling. So thank you, Dr. Dick. I appreciate your time that you've given me personally and also given the audience today.
No, thank you for having me, Doug. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and for inviting me to play some small role in it.
Appreciate it.